In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces tightened their grip on Nazi Germany and victory in Europe appeared imminent, General George S. Patton made a series of predictions about the next war that would prove to be remarkably prescient. Standing in a room full of senior Allied commanders, politicians, and military planners who were focused entirely on finishing the current conflict and establishing a peaceful post-war order, Patton delivered what many in attendance considered to be an inappropriate and alarmist forecast about the future of global conflict. He predicted that the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union would collapse almost immediately after Germany's defeat. That war between the Western democracies and Soviet communism was not just possible but inevitable, and that the longer the West waited to confront Soviet expansion, the more costly that eventual confrontation would become. Most remarkably, he outlined with stunning accuracy the geographic, political, and military contours of what would become the Cold War. Yet despite the accuracy of his predictions, virtually no one in positions of power listened to Patton or acted on his warnings. This is the story of that moment of what Patton predicted, why his predictions were ignored, and what it cost the world that his warnings went unheeded. The specific moment when Patton articulated his most comprehensive predictions about the next war came during a meeting at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in early May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. The meeting had been called to discuss occupation policies, demobilization plans, and the transition from wartime to peacetime operations. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, was present, along with senior commanders from American and British forces, political advisors, and representatives from various Allied governments. The atmosphere was celebratory and forward-looking, with participants eager to discuss the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Patton was invited to this meeting primarily because of his role as a senior Army commander who would have responsibilities in occupied Germany. The expectation was that he would discuss Third Army's current operations, provide input on occupation planning, and participate in discussions about demobilization. Instead, Patton used the opportunity to deliver what amounted to a strategic forecast that challenged every assumption underlying the post-war planning being discussed. He began by stating flatly that the alliance with the Soviet Union would not survive Germany's defeat, that Stalin had no intention of honoring the agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam, and that Soviet forces would not withdraw from territories they currently occupied in Eastern Europe. This opening statement immediately created tension in the room. The entire post-war planning framework was predicated on continued cooperation with the Soviet Union. The agreements about occupation zones in Germany and Austria, the plans for free elections in liberated countries, the vision of a United Nations that would maintain global peace, all of this assumed that the wartime allies would remain partners in peacetime. Patton was challenging this fundamental assumption, and the reaction from most people in the room was discomfort and skepticism. But Patton was just getting started. He predicted that within 2 years, perhaps sooner, an iron curtain would descend across Europe, dividing the continent between Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe and democratic Western Europe. He said that countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria would all fall under communist control despite promises of free elections. He predicted that Germany would be divided, with the Eastern Zone becoming a Soviet satellite state. He foresaw that Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, would become a flashpoint for East-West confrontation. Each of these predictions was met with incredulity from most of those present, yet each would prove to be exactly correct. Patton went further, predicting the military dimensions of the coming conflict. He said that the Soviet Union would maintain enormous conventional forces in Eastern Europe, forces far larger than necessary for defensive purposes. He predicted that the West would need to create a military alliance to counter Soviet power, that American forces would need to remain in Europe indefinitely, and that nuclear weapons would become the primary deterrent, preventing outright war between East and West. He outlined a scenario of permanent military confrontation, of proxy wars in peripheral regions, of ideological competition played out through political subversion and economic pressure. In essence, Patton predicted the Cold War in its major features before World War II had even ended. What made Patton's predictions particularly remarkable was not just their accuracy, but their specificity. He didn't just say that relations with the Soviet Union would deteriorate. He described in detail how and where that deterioration would manifest. He identified specific countries and regions that would become contested territories. He predicted specific military and political dynamics that would characterize East-West relations. And he did all of this at a moment when most Western leaders were still operating under the assumption that Stalin was a difficult but ultimately reasonable partner who could be worked with through diplomacy and good faith. The reaction to Patton's predictions was overwhelmingly negative. Eisenhower, while privately more sympathetic to concerns about Soviet intentions than he could publicly acknowledge, felt compelled to shut down Patton's line of argument. He reminded those present that the Soviet Union was still an ally, that Soviet forces had borne the brunt of the fighting against Germany and deserved recognition for their sacrifices, and that premature speculation about future conflicts with current allies was both inappropriate and potentially damaging to the alliance. He essentially told Patton to keep his predictions to himself and focus on his current responsibilities. The British representatives at the meeting were similarly dismissive, though for different reasons. Winston Churchill, who was not present at this particular meeting but whose views were represented by his military advisors, was actually somewhat sympathetic to concerns about Soviet intentions. But the British government's position was that maintaining the alliance with the Soviet Union was essential for British security, and that openly challenging Soviet actions would be counterproductive. The British view was that any problems with Soviet behavior should be handled through quiet diplomacy rather than confrontation. The American political representatives were perhaps most hostile to Patton's predictions. They reflected the views of the Roosevelt administration and later the Truman administration that cooperation with the Soviet Union was both possible and necessary. They believed that Stalin's concerns about security were legitimate given the history of invasions of Russia, that Soviet actions in Eastern Europe were defensive rather than expansionist, and that patient diplomacy could resolve any disagreements. From their perspective, Patton's predictions were not just wrong, but dangerously inflammatory, the kind of saber-rattling that could create the very conflict they were trying to prevent. Military planners at the meeting focused on the practical impossibility of acting on Patton's predictions, even if they were correct. American public opinion demanded rapid demobilization, the return of soldiers to civilian life, and dramatic reductions in military spending. Congress was already pressuring the military to cut budgets and reduce force levels. The idea of maintaining large military forces in Europe to confront the Soviet Union was politically impossible in 1945. Even if Patton's predictions were accurate, the planners argued, there was no political support for the policies that would be necessary to address the threat he described. The question of why Patton's predictions were ignored, despite their remarkable accuracy, requires understanding the political, psychological, and institutional factors that shaped decision-making in the spring of 1945. First, there was the fundamental human tendency to avoid confronting unpleasant truths, particularly when those truths would require difficult and costly action. Western leaders had just fought an exhausting 6-year war. The public in Britain and America was war-weary and desperate for peace. The idea that another major conflict might be on the horizon, this time with an ally that had helped defeat Germany, was simply too depressing to seriously contemplate. Second, there was the institutional momentum behind the post-war planning that had been underway for years. Enormous effort had gone into crafting the agreements about occupation zones, the United Nations Charter, and the framework for post-war cooperation. Thousands of diplomats, military planners, and political leaders had invested their careers in making these arrangements work. Patton's predictions, if taken seriously, would have meant acknowledging that all of this effort had been based on false premises. The psychological and political cost of that acknowledgement was too high for most people to accept. Third, there was the widespread belief that Patton was not a credible source for strategic political predictions. He was seen as a brilliant tactical commander, but someone who lacked sophisticated understanding of international politics. His virulent anti-communism was well known and was generally attributed to his aristocratic background and reactionary political views, rather than to any genuine insight into Soviet intentions. Many of those who heard Patton's predictions dismissed them as the paranoid fantasies of a right-wing ideologue rather than as serious strategic analysis. Fourth, there was a genuine philosophical disagreement about the nature of Soviet intentions and the possibilities for East-West cooperation. Many Western intellectuals and political leaders in 1945 believed that the Soviet Union, despite its authoritarian political system, was fundamentally a status quo power concerned primarily with its own security. They believed that Stalin's actions, while sometimes heavy-handed, were driven by reasonable security concerns rather than by ideological commitment to world communist revolution. From this perspective, confrontational policies like those Patton seemed to be advocating would be self-fulfilling prophecies, creating the very hostility they claimed to be responding to. Patton's personal credibility was also damaged by his other statements and actions during this period. His criticism of denazification policies, his comparisons of the Nazi Party to American political parties, his suggestions about rearming German forces, all of these created the impression of a man whose judgment about political matters was deeply flawed. When someone makes a series of controversial and often offensive statements, it becomes easier to dismiss even their accurate predictions as the rantings of someone who doesn't understand the complexity of the situation. The messenger problem was significant in this case. The same predictions coming from a different source might have been taken more seriously. When George Kennan, a State Department diplomat, sent his famous long telegram from Moscow in 1946, outlining similar views about Soviet intentions, and the need for containment, his analysis was taken seriously and became the foundation for American Cold War policy. But Kennan was a diplomat with expertise in Soviet affairs, someone whose analysis carried institutional credibility. Patton was a general with a reputation for political tone-deafness, and his predictions were discounted accordingly. What Patton understood that many political leaders at the time did not was the fundamental incompatibility between Soviet communism and Western democracy. He recognized that Stalin's Soviet Union was not a traditional nation-state pursuing limited security objectives, but rather a revolutionary regime committed to spreading its political system and ideology. Patton saw that agreements and treaties would not constrain Soviet behavior because the Soviet leadership did not share Western assumptions about the sanctity of international law and the importance of honoring commitments. This was a level of analysis that went beyond military assessment to political philosophy, and Patton was more insightful about it than many professional diplomats. Patton's predictions were also rooted in his observation of Soviet behavior in territories they occupied. He had seen how Soviet forces treated populations in Eastern Germany, Poland, and other areas they controlled. He had heard reports about mass deportations, political repression, and the installation of communist governments regardless of popular sentiment. He understood that this pattern of behavior reflected deliberate policy rather than the excesses of undisciplined troops, and he predicted correctly that it would be replicated throughout Soviet-occupied territory. The military dimension of Patton's predictions reflected his understanding of the correlation between military capability and political objectives. He recognized that the Soviet Union was maintaining far larger military forces than would be necessary for purely defensive purposes, that Soviet forces were positioned for offensive operations into Western Europe, and that this military posture reflected political intentions to dominate the continent. Western intelligence services would eventually reach the same conclusions, but Patton articulated this analysis months or even years before it became conventional wisdom. One of Patton's most specific predictions concerned Berlin. He predicted that the city would become a focal point for East-West confrontation, that the Western Allies would come to regret allowing Soviet forces to capture it, and that control of Berlin would have enormous symbolic significance in the ideological competition between communism and democracy. When the Berlin blockade occurred in 1948 and the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, Patton's prediction was vindicated in ways that were visible to the entire world. Yet in May 1945, when he made this prediction, it was dismissed as paranoid speculation. Patton also predicted that the division of Europe would create a refugee crisis as people fled from communist-controlled territories to the West. He foresaw that this human flow would create moral and political problems for Western governments, that it would be both a propaganda opportunity and a burden. He predicted correctly that the West would need to absorb millions of displaced persons, and that the treatment of these refugees would become a point of East-West competition. These predictions about the humanitarian consequences of Soviet expansion showed that Patton's analysis went beyond purely military considerations to encompass the broader human costs of the coming confrontation. Perhaps most remarkably, Patton predicted the eventual outcome of the Cold War, though he would not live to see it. He said that Soviet communism contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction, that a system based on coercion and lies could not compete indefinitely with free societies, and that eventually the internal contradictions of Soviet communism would cause the system to collapse. He predicted that this collapse might take decades, that it would require the West to remain strong and united, but that ultimately freedom would triumph over tyranny. This prediction, made in 1945, would be vindicated by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, more than 4 decades after Patton's death. The cost of not listening to Patton's predictions was substantial. Because Western leaders refused to acknowledge the reality of Soviet intentions until it was too late to prevent Soviet consolidation of control over Eastern Europe, millions of people in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other countries were condemned to decades of communist dictatorship. The countries that Patton specifically identified as at risk all fell under Soviet domination, exactly as he predicted. Whether earlier and more forceful Western action could have prevented this outcome is debatable, but the refusal to even seriously consider the possibility that Patton was right meant that no such action was attempted. The military costs were also significant. Because the West demobilized so rapidly after World War II, believing that the Soviet Union would be a cooperative partner in maintaining peace, it found itself in a position of military weakness when Soviet intentions became undeniable. The massive rearmament that became necessary in the late 1940s and 1950s might have been unnecessary if the West had maintained stronger military forces in the immediate post-war period, as Patton advocated. The Korean War, which caught the United States militarily unprepared, might have been deterred or prosecuted more effectively if Patton's warnings about the need for military readiness had been heeded. The ideological and psychological costs were perhaps most significant. Western leaders spent years trying to appease Stalin and accommodate Soviet demands, operating under the assumption that patience and good faith would eventually result in Soviet cooperation. This approach not only failed to achieve its objectives, but also demoralized populations in Eastern Europe who had hoped for Western support against Soviet domination. The perception that the West had abandoned Eastern Europe to communism created lasting resentment and complicated East-West relations for decades. Patton's predictions about the next war were not the only instance of his strategic foresight being ignored, but they were perhaps the most consequential. If Western leaders had taken his warnings seriously, if they had recognized that his analysis of Soviet intentions was more accurate than their own hopeful assumptions, if they had been willing to confront the unpleasant reality that their wartime ally was becoming their peacetime adversary, the entire trajectory of the Cold War might have been different. Eastern Europe might have been spared decades of communist rule. The division of Germany and Berlin might have been prevented. The enormous costs of the arms race and the proxy wars of the Cold War might have been reduced. The question of why Patton was right when so many others were wrong is complex. Part of the answer lies in his personality and worldview. His aristocratic background and conservative political philosophy made him naturally suspicious of communist ideology and Soviet intentions. His military experience had taught him to focus on capabilities and actions rather than on promises and intentions. His study of history had shown him that totalitarian regimes rarely voluntarily limit their own power. All of these factors contributed to his ability to see clearly what others were determined not to see. But Patton's insight also reflected a willingness to accept unpopular truths and to articulate them, despite knowing that he would be criticized and dismissed. Many people in positions of authority in 1945 privately harbored doubts about Soviet intentions, but they kept those doubts to themselves because expressing them openly would have been politically costly. Patton characteristically had no such inhibitions. He said what he believed, regardless of whether it was politically acceptable, and while this trait often got him into trouble, it also freed him to articulate truths that others were too cautious to speak. The vindication of Patton's predictions came too late for Patton himself. He died in December 1945, just months after making his forecasts about the next war, and he never lived to see how accurate those predictions would prove to be. But for those who heard Patton's warnings and dismissed them, the subsequent course of events must have been uncomfortable. As each element of Patton's prediction came true, as the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, as the Cold War developed exactly as he had forecast, those who had been so certain he was wrong had to confront the reality that this supposedly politically naive general had understood the strategic situation better than they did. Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, delivered at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, echoed many of the same themes that Patton had articulated a year earlier. But when Churchill made these arguments, they were taken seriously and helped shape Western policy. The difference was partly timing, as Soviet actions in the interim had made their intentions clearer. But it was also about the messenger. Churchill was a statesman with unquestioned credentials in international affairs. Patton was a general with a reputation for being politically unreliable. The same message from different sources received vastly different receptions. The development of American Cold War policy through the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the formation of NATO essentially implemented the strategic framework that Patton had outlined in his predictions. The recognition that Soviet communism represented an existential threat to Western democracy, that military strength was necessary to deter Soviet expansion, that economic and political measures were needed to strengthen Western Europe against communist subversion, all of this flowed from the same analysis that Patton had presented in May 1945. But by the time these policies were implemented, years had been lost, and Soviet control over Eastern Europe had been consolidated. Historians continue to debate whether earlier action based on Patton's analysis could have prevented the division of Europe, or whether the division was inevitable given the realities of military occupation at the end of World War II. Some argue that Soviet control over Eastern Europe was a fait accompli by May 1945, that Soviet forces already occupied these territories, and that the West lacked the military capability and political will to dislodge them. From this perspective, Patton's predictions were accurate, but his implicit recommendation for immediate confrontation with the Soviet Union was unrealistic. Others argue that the crucial period was not May 1945, but the preceding months, that if Western forces had advanced further east during the final campaigns of the war, they could have occupied territories that instead fell under Soviet control. From this perspective, Patton was not just right about his predictions of future Soviet behavior, but was also right in his earlier arguments for advancing as far east as possible before the war ended. The decision to halt Western advances and leave areas like Prague and Berlin to Soviet liberation was a strategic error that created the conditions for the division of Europe that Patton predicted. The psychological phenomenon of refusing to listen to accurate predictions because they conflict with preferred narratives is well documented in decision-making research. Cognitive biases like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning lead people to discount information that challenges their existing beliefs and to embrace information that supports what they want to believe. In 1945, Western leaders wanted to believe that cooperation with the Soviet Union was possible, that the sacrifices of World War II would lead to a lasting peace, and that the world was entering an era of international cooperation through the United Nations. Patton's predictions challenged all of these hopeful narratives, and the psychological cost of accepting his analysis was too high for most people. The institutional factors that prevented Patton's predictions from being taken seriously also reflect broader problems in how democracies make strategic decisions. Democratic governments are inherently short-term focused, oriented toward the next election cycle rather than toward long-term strategic planning. The costs of confronting Soviet expansion would have been immediate and politically unpopular, while the benefits would have been long-term and speculative. Politicians and officials who prioritize their careers and their current political standing naturally avoided advocating for policies that would be immediately costly, even if they might prevent worse problems in the future. The military establishment's reaction to Patton's predictions reflected the institutional culture of the American military in 1945. The military saw its role as implementing policy decided by civilian leaders rather than making political recommendations. When Patton ventured into strategic political predictions, he was exceeding what many of his colleagues considered the proper role of a military officer. The fact that his predictions were accurate didn't make his colleagues more comfortable with his willingness to publicly challenge civilian policy assumptions. If anything, it made them more uncomfortable because it highlighted the tension between military professional judgment and civilian political authority. The moment Patton predicted about the next war and why no one listened is a story about the difficulty of strategic foresight, the power of wishful thinking, and the costs of ignoring unpopular truths. Patton saw clearly what was coming because he was willing to look honestly at Soviet capabilities and actions rather than at Soviet promises and Western hopes. He understood that ideological regimes behave differently from traditional nation-states, and that Stalin's Soviet Union could not be treated as a conventional diplomatic partner. His predictions were specific, accurate, and delivered at a moment when acting on them might have made a difference. That his warnings were ignored reflects not just his own credibility problems, but broader patterns in how societies respond to predictions of future threats. We tend to discount warnings that require immediate sacrifice to prevent future problems. We prefer to believe that our hopes will be realized rather than that our fears are justified. We shoot the messenger who brings bad news rather than confronting the reality of the situation. All of these tendencies were on display in the reaction to Patton's predictions in May 1945. And all of them contributed to the West's unpreparedness for the Cold War that followed. The vindication of Patton's predictions should serve as a reminder that strategic foresight sometimes comes from unexpected sources, that conventional wisdom is often wrong, and that the political acceptability of a prediction is independent of its accuracy. It should also remind us that listening to unpopular warnings and acting on them requires moral and political courage. a willingness to accept short-term costs to prevent long-term disasters. The leaders who dismissed Patton's predictions in 1945 chose the politically safe and immediately comfortable option of maintaining hopeful assumptions about Soviet intentions. The price of that choice was paid by millions of people in Eastern Europe who lived under communist tyranny for the next 4 decades, and by Western societies that had to mobilize enormous resources to fight a Cold War that Patton had predicted and that might have been prevented or moderated if his warnings had been heeded when they were first delivered.